Madley, co-founder and CEO of Peak Financing, and I have my colleague John Martinez with me today. Obviously, as we talked about on Monday, the big news is that the Fed increased the Fed rate by another 75 basis points, but more importantly, the hope that there is a quick pivoting by the Fed. I think that definitely has been shattered. All right, John. Right. So as we already expected, any hope for a pivoting definitely was shattered yesterday, and I think it's probably best just to dive in and
Sure.
look at some of the statements by the FOMC team. And then we also can touch on what Powell said during his press conference, because that is really equally important. A written statement is one thing. When someone is actually talking it and answering questions from the press, that gives us a much better picture of what they really think. So let's dive right in and let's look at the first piece. When we look at their official statement from yesterday, right? It's interesting to see that obviously they refer to modest growth by indicators. We already have seen that, right? GDP came in at 2.6%. Job gains have been robust, and inflation continues to remain elevated. We already knew that, right? So nothing new to that. But they reiterated also in their statement that they want to achieve maximum employment and inflation rate of 2%. That 2% has been repeated at nauseam. Frankly speaking, I'm a little bit puzzled why someone comes up with 2%. Why is it not 1%? Why is it not 0%? Because in reality, ideally, you have 0% inflation and all asset prices increase thanks to productivity and value add that someone can create. So you still can have price increases, but it's really driven by productivity rather than just by inflation, right? So it's kind of odd that they came up with that 2% target. I think it's just that they have to come up with something that is above zero, because zero obviously is a number that is virtually impossible to achieve in the long run. So, and as we mentioned, right, so they wanted to increase it, and they increased it, the rate by 75 basis points. What is also now important really is that the committee anticipates an ongoing increase in the target rate, right, in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2%. And obviously, we haven't been there yet, right? So very clearly, that is not where we are right now. So that is definitely not working, right? Now, so that is what the committee has said, right? So they clearly want to have a stance that is restrictive for the time to come. So now then Jeremy Powell obviously went into his press conference, as he always does afterwards. You can go on to the Federal Reserve and you can look at the video. I suggest that you actually watch his statements, but as well as the Q&A that follows. When we look at the statement itself, and that's really kind of important that we have an additional statements from him, and this is the transcript from what he said, right? And it's always in our view important to really hear someone talk rather than just issuing a statement. The tone of the message is as important as the words themselves, right? And when we look here, right, clearly, right, my colleagues and I are strongly committed to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal. Again, they have been repeating this now over the last 6 months constantly. So until we see that 2% or that we are in the direction of the 2%, they are clearly now committed to this more than ever. Now, obviously, price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve, right? That is really an important element there and serves as the bedrock of our economy, right? So it is not just, we are trying our best. He is highlighting this is why we are here, right? Now, price stability, the economy will not work for anyone, right? In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve sustained period of strong labor conditions that benefit all. And then, as we know, then they raised the rate by 75 basis points. Now, what is important is also in his statement, right? We continue to anticipate that ongoing increases will be appropriate, right? And we already knew that is coming, but I think also in his tone, as well as in the Q&A, he clearly highlighted that they need to be sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2%, right? And now what he also mentioned, right, we have had all the discussions really were on the rates, but not so much on the balance sheet. And obviously that the buyback of all of the mortgage-backed securities, that discussion has been on the plate for a very long time, but they have not really been that vocal. So now again, they talk about this continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. And again, it's important to highlight that significantly. They clearly want to get the balance sheet shrunk and raise the rates at the same time. This is a very restrictive stance. And any hope, again, anyone had, and the market obviously had that hope based on some comments by some of the Fed members that the pivoting might be on the horizon as early as December. I think that clearly with his own statements, that hope clearly has been shattered, right?
Right.
And then again, right, so he mentions it again, restoring price stability will likely require maintaining a restrictive stance of policy for some time, right? So it's not that, okay, so now we have started 6 months ago, and now we have reached the end, and now we are plateauing out. They clearly realize it hasn't worked the way they thought it would work, right? And I think that's just important to understand. That's where the Fed is today. They woke up to it, and I think it's frankly speaking, it's a good thing. It just obviously from a market perspective, we always hope that is not the case, right? Now, what is certainly also important to point out is, right, despite the slowdown in growth, the labor market remains extremely tight, right? With unemployment at 50-year low. Now, naturally, we can have a lot of discussion. Is the unemployment measured in the right fashion? But even if we are off a little bit, the reality is, and I think anyone who has been trying to hiring employees, they have faced tremendous challenges. So we certainly have a good argument that the unemployment is still in a very good spot, and obviously that has an impact on inflation, and we can touch on that, right, John, a little bit later when we talk about productivity. Now, inflation obviously remains well above the 2% goal. Again, here, 2% mentioned once again. I have never seen or heard them talk about that 2% for so many times in a short period of time. And obviously, the Fed also acknowledges that the inflation data have again come in higher than what they expected, right? And again, that is important to understand that the Fed clearly have underestimated it, not just slightly but significantly, right? And we can point fingers as much as we want. It's not science. It's really an art, right? We just do not know. And frankly speaking, COVID has created an environment that we have not experienced in the past. So it's easy to point fingers. Obviously, everyone hoped that the inflation would be transitory. Many of us felt that is a pipe dream, but obviously many also have hoped that it would be transitory. So now again, right, when we talk about the pivoting question here, the message clearly is long-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, right? And that is not grounds for complacency. The longer the current bout of high inflation continues, the greater the chance that expectations of higher inflation will become entrenched, right? So very clearly, they have the view that if we do not fix it now, it will be an ongoing problem that is just mushrooming into a situation that is going to be much worse. And they realize that the inflation imposes significant hardship, right? Now, naturally, some of us will benefit from high inflation, but at the broader scale, it really is not benefiting anyone in the long run. And as a result, here again, the 2% are mentioned again. We strongly are committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective. So it cannot be clearer in his tone. That's what they want to do. So there is just not a chance that we are going to see that pivoting happening. And again, right, we anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds will be appropriate, right? Ongoing increases. So it's not let's just now do another one in December and then taper off. Clearly, the message is we are going to increase multiple times going forward.
Yes.
Then naturally, it will take time, however, for the full effect of monetary restraint to be realized, especially in inflation, right? So it will take time, right? So it's not just a quick fix. Now, the positive part is they acknowledge, right, at some point, and again, at some point, it will become appropriate to slow the pace of increases. So now that's the good news, right?
Yes.
The question is, when is that point? And there is significantly uncertainty. They acknowledge this, right? So we still have some ways to go, and incoming data suggests, since our last meeting, suggests that the ultimate level of interest rates will be higher than previously expected, right? So, in other words, if there was any hope in September, yes, I think we are on the right path. This message here essentially says, sorry guys, but we underestimated it. Now we are higher than what we thought it would be, right? And then we are taking forceful steps to moderate demand so that it comes into better alignment with supply, right? Uh, so again, very clearly, a, a very strong message that has come here from Powell in his press conference, and naturally it's a tough situation to be in for everyone, and for Powell and his team, it's definitely that communication. It was definitely not easy, and this is really the key message here, right? The historical record cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy, right? We will stay the course until the job is done. And so very clearly, we are not talking about pivoting here by any measure. So if you so that was his official statement, and then we also went into a Q&A. That's what he always does, right? So now
Yeah.
here, some of his answers, I think, were also telling, right? When he mentioned, to be clear, let me say again, the question of when to moderate the pace of increases is now much less important than the question of how high to raise rates and how long to keep monetary policy restrictive, right? So in other words, look, we can raise 1% and another 2%, and then we may be there, or we raise it in over the next 12 months or 6 months, whatever it is. But ultimately, the question is, to what level do they need to raise it that it actually makes sense to keep the inflation under control? So clearly, yes, that statement is very clear. I think the market has been focusing a little bit too much on the rate increases, but not really on where the ultimate rate is going to be. Some people call it the terminal rate. I think it's kind of a silly naming for it, because nothing when it comes to rates is ever terminal, right? It's more like where does it have to be for a period of time until inflation is under control, and then hopefully the rates can come down and be more or less in line with where inflation for that year is going to be, right? Now, here again, right, in his Q&A, he repeats it again. It is very premature to be thinking about pausing, right? Now, obviously, if they raised it 3 times, let's say, by 75 basis points, then they may be able to pause, right? But if they raised it only by 50 basis points, then it will just take longer until they can pause. We have ways to go. We need ongoing rate hikes to get to that level of restricting, right? Ongoing rate hikes, right? So to put that pivot discussions to the rest, I think it cannot be more clearly communicated than this. Now, again, right? So they are not masters of the universe, and he acknowledges it, right?
Yep.
We do not know where that exactly is, right? We have a sense, right? So obviously they make guesses, they look at data, and they look at data constantly, and hopefully the data points give them enough information that they are able to go where they need to go with the rate increases. Now, uh, they he mentioned, right, in the December meeting, that is when they come up with a new summary of economic projections, and that will then also be the time when they can potentially communicate where the target rates are going to be, right? So
Right.
that's where we stand, right? So as you can see, he answered a lot of questions, and so at the end, one of the last questions, uh, one of the questions was, why do you feel like the window has narrowed, right? And Powell responded, well, we haven't seen inflation coming down, right? We would have expected goods inflation to come down by now, long since by now, right? But it
Yeah.
really hasn't, right? So now he acknowledges it has come down a little bit, but it just hasn't come down nearly as much as what he anticipated, right? And now, equally important, right? At the same time, now we see services inflation, uh, and core services inflation moving up, right? I think the inflation picture has become much more challenging over the course of this year, right? And remember, that was just at the end of the press conference. That means that we have to have the policy more restrictive. That narrows the path of a soft landing, right? So he acknowledges we are in a very difficult situation, but they essentially do not have a choice uh, to do this, and uh, unfortunately, that's just where we stand. Now, again, we just went through a couple of items here. If you want to listen to his press conference, including answering questions, that's where you can go to federalreserve.gov. I strongly suggest, if you want to have also kind of hear his tone of his messaging, that's always worthwhile to spend a few minutes there, right? So the last statement was productivity, right? Goods inflation, and you also mentioned service, right? So, John, you mentioned that you also
Yeah.
read a number of comments about the productivity, and again how that is has an impact on inflation.
Yeah. So you just kind of going through some news yesterday and this morning. Some articles are pointing out that third quarter unit non-farm labor productivity gains were less than expected for the third quarter after significantly lower numbers, negative numbers, basically that you have less, you're going the opposite direction for the first half of the year. And so I think that is intuitive of what we've seen in the news and what we might expect, and what we would look at as far as maybe that third quarter productivity gain number being lower is that if it were at level as expected or maybe higher, then you would see people trying to garner noise in the market saying, hey, look, we've got this benefit coming to us. We're having productivity gains that's going to alleviate pressure for our actual unit labor cost. And when we look at unit labor cost, again, that in turn was higher than it was higher. Well, not I shouldn't say higher, but was on a positive projection again, less than maybe the second and third quarter of the year. But what that sets up is that at least from a headline number, when we look over on a year-over-year basis, that the unit cost of labor is significantly increased. And some articles are pointing out that we're on a year-over-year growth trajectory that is the highest as of third quarter going back to 1982. So not necessarily unexpected, because the year-over-year numbers, we build them up quarterly. We can see that coming to us, but definitely worth headline grabbing to say we're in an environment not seen since the early 80s, and that just really puts a lot of folks, I think, in an environment where for a while now we've been having to challenge ourselves to understand how do we set our expectations. So just that is contextually what we're looking at as far as the need to see that productivity growth to help alleviate some of these inflationary pressures in labor, because it really does add to the pressure that Chairman Powell noted at the very end of his comments that you just highlighted.
Yeah. So I think, again, when we listen to him, right, so he is very concerned about goods inflation, obviously, but also the service inflation. And that combined will be, in my view at least, will be a challenge for some time to come. Unfortunately, right, COVID really has created a change in worldview by many countries around the world, particularly the Western world, right? Over the last 30 years, more or less, the world went into a so-called offshoring mode, and I was part of that, right? I worked and lived in Asia for around 7 years, and guess what we did there on behalf of Western-based companies? We helped them with real estate, with manufacturing, and associated financing to offshore into lower cost markets. So we have benefited from that offshoring for almost 30 years, and COVID has obviously shown us that the supply chains of that offshoring are not as solid as everyone thought. And now what do we see? Everyone is re-onshoring. And the reality is, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in Western Europe, and other high-cost labor markets, high labor cost markets, they all will all be having a lot of challenges in onshoring and keeping cost of goods and services down. That's just the nature of it. You cannot undo that 3 decades of reducing costs by going into low labor cost markets and then bring it back home and think that that doesn't have inflationary pressure. So to be really fair, right, even what the Fed is attempting to do here is, in a normal environment, if globalization and offshoring would be back to where we were pre-COVID, I do not believe the Fed would have such a massive problem at hand. But that onshoring effort clearly is a major issue that everyone has to deal with, and I think the Fed will have a very hard time to keep the inflation under control just because of that, right? We obviously do not want that our labor force here in the United States has to take wage cuts, right? But reality is, whatever manufacturing or services are being brought back and onshored onto US soil, they will out of China, out of Vietnam, out of other markets, low-cost markets, they have to be more expensive for the end user, whether it's a company that is using these goods or services, or then the ultimate final consumer around the country. And I think that is just what no one is really recognizing, the massive impact that re-onshoring has.
And we're just discussing a little bit before we started, Tom, but those are not transitory effects, correct? And these are headwinds, or rather pressures, that net vector either up or down. But in this instance, it feels like that'll be around for quite some time, because you just don't, 6 months with a business plan, and you're producing widgets back on shore again, right? Um, so, those seem to be likely things that we'll have to deal with, and appropriately, expectations built around that. But that seems like that's around for longer, going forward.
Yes, yeah. So now the question is, what is better for us who are in the commercial real estate field when it comes to financing real estate transactions, right? Would you like to have slow increases over the next 12 months, or would you like to see quick, larger increases over the next few months and then be done with it and plateauing out there? Remember, Powell clearly said the level that we want to achieve is going to be achieved either with quick increases or slow increases. So put it in the comment what your preference is. My view on this is really, I think if you have a loan that is becoming due in 2024 or later, you probably want that they have faster increases, so the economy gets into a quicker correction, which then stabilizes everything, which hopefully also then will bring rates down. If they do slow increases, I think it will just drag everything out for a longer period of time, and then we may still have significantly elevated interest rates even into 2024 and beyond. Ultimately, I think anyone who has a loan maturing, whether it's a bridge loan or another loan maturing in 2023, it's really time now to think how to tackle this situation, particularly the ones that have taken out bridge loans that mature next year, because as we know, a lot of these bridge loans were underwritten to very aggressive exit interest rates in the mid threes to maybe upper threes, and now we are in the 5.5% to 6% of permanent loans plus, right? So they are clearly in a tough spot. So if you are in that, happy to discuss it with you, what the solutions potentially could be. But I think anyone that has loan maturing 2023, you really have to start tackling that problem today. There is very little hope that interest rates will come down over the next 12 months, right? So hopefully 2024 with strong, faster increases, we'll see that. But 2023 is definitely not the year where we see lower rates, at least in the first 9 months of 2023. Any final comments, Sean, before we say goodbye?
No, thanks for having me on. It's great visiting. Keep an eye out for more market-worthy commentary, news items to come back and share with our audience.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks everyone for joining, and see you next time.
Okay, sir.